Hi, my name is Lee Davis, one of the pastors here at Berlin Church in Lewis Center.
And I'm Rick Negley. Thank you for being with us today.
We're following up from our Mother's Day sermon meditation from Numbers chapter 6. We find that God favorably blesses his people, and as an extension, he calls them to be a blessing to others. They have been blessed that they might be a blessing to others. On Tuesday, our follow-up discussion was about how we cultivate minds and hearts that actually believe that God is favorably disposed toward us, that his countenance shines upon us, that he smiles upon us, despite the fact that we know that we so often don't deserve it. Today, we'd like to talk about how we can extend that to others. So for our moms, for our grandmothers, we want to talk a little bit today about how you can nurture those under your care to actually believe that God is favorably disposed toward them, because we want this to grow generationally. So Rick, how can our mothers and grandmothers nurture their children, their grandchildren in such a fashion that they learn to believe and actually are committed to the belief that God is favorably disposed toward them?
Well, it all begins with God and ends with God. It's God through and through. And I remember over and over again as I was growing up, seeing my mom in prayer, kneeling by her bed, and that memory is etched in my mind that she was going to the Lord, seeking God's grace for her to be a mom and praying for her three sons. And I'm sure that that was used powerfully by God throughout my life. But as we said in our last conversation about God's face being turned towards us, once we have experienced God's face turned towards us in grace, we're enabled then to turn our faces towards our children and grandchildren with grace. And I'm finding that in these days of social distancing and isolation from my own children and grandchildren, that when I see them, I just want to soak up their face, just look into their eyes and see their faces, and it brings such joy to me. And I want my expression when I look at them to be favorable towards them. I know when our children were little that when there were too many times when I would be reminded that communication was mostly about nonverbal communication. What was the expression on my face? And so when we look to our children and our grandchildren to remember God's grace to us and then allow that grace to shine to them as well.
I think the area of discipline is an important thing for us to consider as well. If you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, you know that discipline is necessary. Our children are born with foolish hearts and foolish minds, and they often pursue foolish things. And it is not unloving to discipline them and to teach them about what is right and what is wrong. In fact, to teach them about God's law and his expectations. Now, we know God's law does not save anyone. It only shows us our sin, but that is very, very necessary. So it is very loving to teach our children the difference between right and wrong and to show them there are consequences for wrong. But the reality is the gospel, the good news of Jesus, that he died to take our sin and rose again to conquer sin and death and to offer us his righteousness. This good news, this is the only thing that can save. And so in regard to discipline, you must do it. But just as Rick said, we must do it carefully and gently. The truth of the matter is very often what we convey to our children is not that they've offended God, but that they've offended us. So be very, very careful with anger, with countenance, the way your face appears, with even body language. Do not discipline out of anger. Have a discussion with your spouse whenever you are not angry, outside of normal disciplining times, about how it's going. Talk to each other. Find common ground. Surround yourself with other parents who do it well. Ask them questions. This is hard because we take our parenting very seriously, and our pride can get tweaked when we realize we're not doing it perfectly. But seek counsel from those who have done it well, particularly older parents, and ask them to help. And then always, as exhausting, as inefficient as this may be, end discipline time by pointing your children back to the good news of Jesus. Because ultimately, doing the right thing, keeping you happy, is not their hope. Jesus is their hope. As I've already hinted at, discipline is anything but efficient. But it's necessary as we nurture the hearts of our children and grandchildren to believe that God is favorably postured toward them, to be very careful in the way that we approach them, even in this very common and necessary area like discipline. Any final thoughts today, Rick?
Well, moms and the rest of us will fail at this, and the good news is that we can go back to a loving and merciful and gracious God, and we can receive his forgiveness and his mercy again and again, and that we can model repentance to our children. So when we fail, we can use that as an opportunity to say, I blew it, I messed up, I was wrong, will you forgive me? And know that they will, and that we can always, in all of these things, remember that God's face is turned towards us in Jesus Christ.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We love you.